And I'd always just say to myself, you don't know what's around the bend in the road. And even when I'd feel like giving up, I just say, just hold on. And, my God and my guides would just say, don't give up, just keep going. And sometimes it is really hard work, but the more you do it, the better you get at it.
Welcome to Supernormalized, the podcast where we challenge the conventional, break boundaries, and normalize the seemingly supernatural. Join me, CJ, as we explore less uncharted realms of existence and unravel the mysteries of life experience. My treasured listeners, if you have a life story or healing modality or unique knowledge that you'd love to share, reach out to me at supernormalized, that's supernormalized with a Z, at proton.me. Let's together embrace acceptance of the supernatural and unusual as what it really is, completely normal. Today on Supernormalized, I have a discussion with Doug McIntyre. Doug has been through a lot of experiences to do with satanic ritual abuse and the Australian arm of MKUltra, and he's a survivor, and he's been through a lot and found ways through that actually involved him writing for himself a new soul contract. So I wanted to title this show can changing your soul contract be beneficial? Because I'm certain this is exactly what this show is about. It was a great conversation, and I'm sure you'll enjoy it as much as I did. So please enjoy the show. Welcome to Supernormalized, Doug McIntyre. Doug has had quite an intense life, but it's also led into a life of spirituality and self-understanding. I won't tell much of his story because the better person to say that is actually Doug himself. So welcome to the show, Doug.
Hey, CJ, nice to meet you.
Good to meet you too. So Doug, where do you want to start with this? Because I mean, it's actually quite a big story arc, and you've been through a lot.
Yeah, I think as we've talked about before, a lot of people may be aware of MKUltra, satanic ritual abuse, and things like that. So I have a background in both. I was born in Sydney in the 1960s at St George Hospital in Kogarah, which is a southern suburb of Sydney. Um, Most of my life I've been through extreme trauma and neglect, or I should say most of my childhood I've been through extreme trauma and neglect. And as a result, that developed a lot of supernatural abilities that I needed to survive. And in more and more recent years, or as time went on in my early adulthood, I started remembering a lot of these memories that have been blocked, and that's progressed where I still have memory gaps, but I'm remembering more and more. Now I'm part of a network of survivors who are remembering. We're correlating our evidence, and we're sort of moving forward, trying to expose what's been going on and the impact it's had on society.
I'm curious to know about, okay, so you're going through these intense experiences at a young age, and you said that you basically escaped into the supernatural and deeper understanding of the more spiritual sort of world of your own making. What happened for you there? I mean, what do you mean by, did you have spirit contact or anything like that? What was going on?
Well, because my body wasn't safe, I went through extreme physical, sexual, mental abuse, as well as torture and different things, as did a number of other kids at that time. Um, because you don't feel safe in your body, you've got to find somewhere safe to go to. And I was forced disassociated, which means my personality was fractured. And so I would go into the psychic realms. That was somewhere that I did feel safe. It wasn't always safe because at times I was given LSD and things like that.
Mm.
And I found that terrifying as a little child. But generally, I had this, and just this connection to spirit, connection to source. And I
Mm.
remember when I was 5 years old, it was quite funny looking back. I walked past a church and I thought, oh, I'm going to be involved with that one day. But a church to me meant fates, stalls, going and buying things like that. So, a church it didn't mean, I didn't realize it meant God, if I can put it that way. But I knew one day I'd be involved in it. And later in life, I became a Christian minister. I went to Bible college and became a lay pastor and was very involved in the church. But in my childhood, that was, particularly being in a ritual abuse family, that was one of the worst things I could have done. But yeah, so from about the age of 5, I developed, very clear psychic abilities as a result of my trauma. So I could go out of body, I could be asleep while awake, I could be awake while asleep. As a child, if I had nightmares, I would sit there during the day and think about the nightmares and work out how to stop them, for example. And then that night I'd go into the nightmares and remember what I'd done during the day and confront my night terrors, and then I never had nightmares again. So since about the age of 5, I've probably had 3 or 4 nightmares, and that's about it. But that was because at that age I could, analyze them, go into them at night, and then, if there's something was chasing me, I'd just turn around and say, get me. And it wouldn't. I'd say, see, it didn't hurt. And then I wouldn't have any nightmares. I had some pretty good things in amidst all the abuse and trauma, which were quite helpful. And, I think, well, I was a very stubborn child. I would get to the point where I'd hit my limits as a child, and I would turn around and confront my father, who's a serial killer. And that was life-threatening normally. One time I had a brick thrown at my face, another time the kitchen table. At different times, I was taken up the mountains to be thrown off the cliffs or taken to the beaches in Sydney. And when they're all closed, there's a little kid who couldn't swim, dropped in the rip, and it was just that a lone surfer walking by came out and rescued me. And, he almost died as well. So, my childhood wasn't what you would call normal. My parents never touched me and things like that. So in order to survive, I developed this very powerful, loving relationship with the divine. And I felt totally hated by my parents, and I hated them as a child as well because of the abuse they put me through. On the other side, I would talk to God every night and just talk about, and just say, you're my true father, you're the one that looks after me, you're the one that loves me. And that somehow kept me going. It was a miracle I survived with everything. And I was suicidal for most of my childhood because that seemed to be the only way out. But at different times, it was like, my God or my guides would come to me and show me the futility of doing that. And often, in the midst of all this trauma, I'd always be given a way out. And even in adulthood, I had different times where, I got to breaking point. I remember one time I was, this is, probably about, about 15 years ago, and some things that happened because of the trauma in my life, you keep setting yourself up to relive it. And, I was driving down to jump off the cliffs and I got pulled over for speeding on the way. And the police officer screamed and yelled at me because, I obviously wasn't paying attention to the road rules. And I just said to him, I'm having a really bad day. And he was screaming and ranting. And I just said, well, look, I'm just having a really bad day. And he just stopped. Something impacted him. He just stopped in the middle of it. And he just looked at me and said, don't do it again, and walked off. And that was enough to turn my car around and went home. So I've had, a lot of experiences sort of like that. But it was, so I feel very, it might seem quite ironic. I feel very protected. And when I talk to friends and relatives who've been through what I've been through, we often experience the same. And sometimes we wonder whether we've chosen, as our life contract to come into these bloodline families that are extremely abusive as a way to try and stop the cycle.
Yes.
And so that's how sometimes we sort of try and make sense of it, because, some of the friends I have, and they live across Australia and around the world, and, we talk to each other often, and we can talk quite candidly about the abuse that we've been through, which I've learnt for most people is way too confronting. I've lost a lot of friends who I've been upfront with about my past. But, we really feel that this is, part of our life contract was to come here and to try and stop that ongoing cycle of abuse, because ancestral abuse is very important in bloodline families. You want every family to be traumatized, so it goes on from generation to generation to generation. That's where, we have very low self-esteems, and also where we're easy to mind control. So, there's all these sorts of issues, but it can be quite a slow process to waking up. So whilst as a child, I became very, very psychic. I think at an early age, probably I think it was about 12, I found an old Bible with no covers on it that was, bottom of the cupboard, that had belonged, I think, to my grandmother. And, I just found it and started reading it. So, I became an avid reader. I think I read 300 books when I was 13 in that year. And I read the Bible cover to cover again and again and again. And so I developed this very powerful relationship with my concept of God. I'd never been to a church at that stage. And, I used to feel like the wisest boy in the world. I'd read Proverbs and things like that. And, I'd be in this horrific childhood, but, walking to school, I remember just sitting there thinking, like, wow, I've got all this wisdom, I'm learning all this stuff. But then when I eventually went to church, I was actually quite horrified, because it wasn't what I think I'd expected or anticipated. So it wasn't that it was necessarily bad, but it's, even though I got very involved in organised religion, it was something I really struggled with, and I was a bit of a round peg in a square hole. And, I would just have faith and believe that things had happened, and that upset a lot of people. So, that sort of lasted probably for about 15 years, my involvement with the church, and then that ended badly. I ended up going through a divorce, and I got ostracized, quite badly, and ended up having to take the church to court. So it was a bit of a, things going full circle. And I won in court, and I didn't want to, but there were abuse issues that were going on with my children and things like that. And so it's been an interesting journey, and I didn't stay particularly in one church. I went through a variety of denominations. I was quite interested in learning, and I went to a number of different Bible colleges and, excelled at it. But it tended to run its course, because I think because I had such a personal relationship with the divine, or with source, or, whatever people want to call God, it was something that was much more powerful than organised religion. And so I really struggled, particularly, when I'd preach, and that I'd more try to, teach people about how to develop that personal relationship, because that was what was, really important to me. And then after I left the church, and because at one stage I was an evangelical Christian, so I was very much into, what I call worshipping the Bible, I started exploring other modalities. So I started doing past life regressions, I started doing psychedelics, I started, looking at other forms of spirituality and things like that, and then starting to really think, well, what works for me? And I realized, because of the level of trauma I had from a mental health perspective, the past life, life contract, life review, belief system, if I can put it that, was what kept me most sane, if I could put it that way. I still have a profound, respect for Christ and the teachings of Christ, realizing, I think, that the church has manipulated a number of them. But it's just, now I'm very much, into the whole thing of life contracts. That's works very well for me. The whole idea of, and, my first life contract ended. And there's a story there. My soul group was changed. There was another story there. So my guides would come to me. I'd had a very intuitive life where, at one stage I'd get cranky with them, because I'd say, can you just let me make a decision for a while? Because everything I do, they go here, do this, go here. I want you to talk to this person, and every day was like that. And it was quite, intense. And, it was incredible. Sometimes I'd get it wrong, listening and things like that. Other times I'd get it right. Some things would be quite benign, like, I'll be driving to the city, and I'll go 3 streets down, 2/3 along the street, there's a park on the left-hand side. And I'd go down, and sure enough, there would be. Other times it wouldn't work. Other times it'd be like, I'd look at someone and I could tell that they were carrying a lot of trauma. And I remember one young man I went up to, and I said, look, tell them to piss off if you want, but, you know, have you been sexually abused? And he looked at me and he says, I've never told anyone in my life, but how did you know that? And I said, well, I haven't. I picked this and this up, and these are the things that have helped me. And I don't know if they'll help you, but this is what's helped. Anyway, we didn't swap details or anything. And then about 6 months later, we crossed paths again, just randomly. And he ran up to me and threw his arms around me, and he was just a totally different person. And, you know, and they're the things that I like, because I feel that that makes triumph out of my tragedy. You know, the horrors I went through don't just end in horrors, you know. And, you know, I love that side of my path. I love the spiritual side. I love that despite what I've been through, I have this just this serenity, you know. And I know when I die, you know, I've made peace with death. I've died and come back. You know, I've had so many close calls with death. It's not funny. So it's you know, yeah, it's a crazy life, but never boring.
No, no, it sounds like a very involved life, and it sounds also too that you have a very big self-guided spirituality there that does actually involve a bit of Christianity and Christian technology, and you know, and respect for the Christ consciousness, which is really, really good as far as I'm concerned. I see that as a very powerful sort of force in the world, and a good force for change, and I'm glad that you've embraced it in that way. And so, when did that actually start for you? I mean, when you started to really believe and have this extra sense of God walking beside you, no matter what.
Um, well, I've always had it, but it's probably it started when I started reading the Bible. Then that, you know, that was, you know, just processing that. On, you know, as I said, I was just reading it myself. It was an old King James Bible.
Mm.
Um, you know, thee, thy, thou, and it, you know, the Bible is this old musty smelling thing with sort of the gold along the edge of the paper and things like that. And I just lie in bed and, you know, read it under the blanket sort of thing. Um, and that was a profound thing, because that, you know, helped me, you know, understand probably more of the history of Christianity. Um, and before that, I dabbled a little bit in Zen Buddhism and things. So, you know, I'd always had this spiritual bent. But with that, and with the trauma at home, which was quite extreme at the time,
Mm.
that was, you know, I cried out to God basically and said, look, you know, I'm suffering, I need help, I'm not coping, you know, I don't know if I'm going to survive, you know, as a little kid. And then through my teenage years, and then, you know, my father was brutal to say the least. And when my parents divorced, then my mother doubled down on me and got even, you know, things got even worse with her. And so at the age of 18, I had to leave home. But it was, you know, I grew up in the western suburbs of Sydney in Mount Druitt. And when we're in, I think it was year 10 or year 11, and so I'd had this whole, you know, reading the Bible from cover to cover, but interpreting it myself through my own lens. So I, you know, had never heard a sermon, I'd never been inside a church, you know, anything like that. And then we had a couple of people come to our school who were, I wouldn't say evangelists, but they came and worked with us, because, you know, Mount Druitt was a public housing. Amazing. They were like really genuine Christian loving people. And through them, a lot of our school became Christian, which was quite powerful. And that was a really, really good time. Went on, you know, church camps and different things like that. For me to get away from home was, you know, my safety and things like that. Sadly, the guy who ran it died not long after, and that sort of tended to end that whole thing. But by then I'd finished my schooling, and I left home for my own sanity and to escape, and then put myself through university. But then at university I went to another church, um, and then when I finished uni, you know, I moved into another part of Sydney. So my mother had remarried, and in the meantime, my brother had been killed. He and I were living together at Bondi when he was killed, and
Mm.
so I ended up moving back with them. And then I got involved in another church down there, and that's when I went into youth leadership and got asked to, you know, we're in a very conventional church. We went through a phase of charismatics and things like that. So he moved into signs and wonders and the John Wimber movement. And so the church split down the middle because half the church, the older people in the church wanted to do, conventional Christianity, and the younger half of the church wanted to do, embrace more modern Christianity, if I can put it that way. And so the church split, and as part of that split, a friend and I were asked to leave the new church. And so, we did that, and then I went back, and then my ex-wife and I, we were going to become missionaries. So, then I went to a charismatic Bible college and then started doing a degree in intercultural studies. So, had my hand in lots of pies, if I can put it that way. But from a Christian point of view, that was sort of my journey. But then, as I said, when I got divorced, that also came crashing down, and not personally, I still have a very powerful faith, but in terms of being within an organised religion, that was basically the end of it.
Okay. So you got to a certain point in your life, and things were not going so well for you. You actually got a bit stuck in some ways, from what I understand it there, with your soul contract ending. What was going on for you to actually get to that sort of point, and what was that feeling like to get there, and then what happened?
Well, I was actually I've got a farm. I left Sydney and moved to the country. And that was interesting. So I've been looking to move to the country for about 10 years, and just looking online, and I hadn't been well because of all the trauma. My body was shutting down, and at different times my heart and lungs had shut down. I'd be hemorrhaging internally. So I had a lot of serious health issues that were trauma related, but I didn't realize at the time they were trauma related. But I just knew I had to leave Sydney in order to heal. One day I looked at the place where I live came up online. I'd never heard of it before, and my guide said that's where you're meant to live. And I thought, okay. And so I came down with a girlfriend at the time to have a look, and I didn't have any money, and just wanted to get an idea of where my guides are telling me I'm meant to live. And the second farm I looked at, she goes, "Oh, you're meant to have this." I said, "I know, but I don't have any money." And the agent said, "We'll make an offer." And well, anyway, I went back with the farm. So that was, I've had a lot of things like that happen. And so when I was at this farm one day, and when I bought the farm, I said to the universe, "What am I meant to do on the farm?" And they said, "You're meant to build a healing centre here." And it's 20 years since I've bought it, roughly. And now after 20 years, I healed out there. But we're now looking at getting the beginnings of that going. But I was on the farm one day about 10 years ago, I think it was, with a friend, and he'd fallen asleep next to the campfire, and I was just standing next to the dam looking at it. And my guides came to me and they said, "Your life contract's over." And I said, "What?" And they said, yeah. They said, "You preordained for it to end in this second." They said it wasn't about you achieving anything. It's just that this is the exact moment in time. You decided that your life contract was going to end, and here you are, and it's not ended. And I'm like, well, I didn't know this could happen. This is a bit weird. I'm thinking, what's going on? So I was like, okay. So I walked up on the hill because it was just on sunset, and I used to do sun gazing. And so I walked up on the hill, and I'm looking at the sun and watching it set. I'm staring into it as you do with the sun gazing. And I got a bit bored. And as I turned around, the moon was rising behind me. So it was like I was stuck between the sun and the moon, the earth and the sky, because I was right on the top of the Great Dividing Range, the night and day and everything like that. It was like everything converged. And it was this incredibly powerful spiritual moment for me. And then I looked at them, and anyway, so that was interesting. And then so I'm sitting there thinking about it, and went back to where I was living, because I wasn't living on there at that stage. And I looked at my hand, and I had a ring on, and I hadn't worn it for 30 years. That was a sun moon ring. So it was all these things seemed to converge in that moment. But I'm like, I didn't realize my life contract could just end like that. So even though I was experienced in doing the Akashic records, I'd learned how to access them quite easily. I decided to get some friends who are also experienced in that, and other friends who are psychics. And I said to them, "Well, this is what's happened. What am I meant to do?" Because I started getting sick. And they said, "Well, you've got to do a new life contract, because if you don't do the new life contract," because when they went in and talked to my guides and that, because I wanted an independent point of view, they said, "Well, if you don't do a new life contract, well, then you basically just die." So then I had to go and talk to people who were experienced in it. One friend was a psychic, was always arguing with his guides about his life contracts. And he was always telling me about the arguments he's having with them. So I know he would be a perfect person to talk to. And so then I sat down and I thought, well, what do I want? I had a very traumatic life. And I thought, well, maybe if I ask for the opposite of what I've had, then I can do a compare and contrast. And that might be a good way to learn. So I said, well, let's try and have a life that's, the opposite of what I've had. So, while I'm in this incarnation, I can learn rather than, going back after I've died and sitting there and, looking at what I've learned. I thought, well, maybe there's scope for doing that in this. And so I, did a fairly, what I'd call basic life contract. And it was quite interesting. It was like all the energies in my life shifted. So previously, where I would attract a lot of trauma and traumatic things to me, all of a sudden I was attracting things that weren't traumatic. And, I was, I was attracting abundance on a whole different level. And I'm not just talking about financial or things like that, but the interesting thing was with my first life contract, at times it was like I'm fighting the energy to survive. Whereas under the new life contract, it was like, even if I didn't try, I would thrive. So, so it was like hopping, to me, it was like being in one river that flows, say when you think of Australia, on one river that flows inland and all the way down to the Murray or something like that, and hopping into that and hopping in another river that flows down to the Pacific Ocean. And it just feels like that. And it was quite remarkable because once the contract had changed, it was like it wasn't that I didn't need to do anything, but it was just energetically everything had shifted because the contract had shifted and everything I attracted to myself shifted and so on. I mean, my friendships changed, all sorts of things changed. And then about 3 years ago, I've been having ongoing issues with my family and abuse, including poisonings and things like that. And so I had to go to the police because, again, I was being poisoned. I was starting to get quite sick and things like that. And my guides came to me again and they said, we want to change your soul group. And I said, I must sound quite naive, but I'm sitting there thinking, I don't know anyone who's had this happen, So I'm like, what am I meant to do? So unlike with the life contract where I sort of just sort of accepted it, I said, well, how about I have a think about this time? I want to just process this and understand this a little bit more before I just say yes. And so I sat down and I thought about it for 2 or 3 days and I came back because, as I said, my family, who are part of my soul contract, have always been very abusive towards me. And I turned around and I said to my guides, I think that's a really good thing. So they said, okay, so we're moving you from your old soul group who've become highly, highly abusive. And they said, we're moving you to a new soul group who are going to be incredibly loving. And I said, well, what's going to happen to my family? And they said, oh, don't worry about that. And I'll sort it out in 2 or 3 lifetimes. And I'm like, oh, okay. And so that's been another incredible journey because whilst I'm under this new life contract and I've now been asked to now sit down and make a third one because they said, now that you've learned a bit, we want you to be a bit more clear on your new one. And so I'm putting a lot more, energy and attention into that. But with my family, I end up cutting them off for the third time for good because it was just for my own safety and things like that. But it was like the energetic connection to them dissipated to the point where I feel no energy to my parents or siblings whatsoever. Previously I'd feel all sorts of different emotions. Despite my mother being abusive, I'd still want her to love me, and there'd be all these different interplays of, like parent-child, mother-child, all these sorts of things. I'd cut my father off 40 years ago out of safety, so I hadn't spoken to him for that period. But it just got to the point where once I changed the soul group, there was no energetic connection to them. And so it's been an incredible journey of energy and how most of what we do in this world is just energy.
Mm,
Yeah.
mm. I'm very curious though. It sounds like you've actually built a lot of skills around understanding soul contracts and changing them and help. Maybe is this something you do with other people? Can you help people with their soul contract and recognizing what's possible to change?
I haven't done it formally. I do a lot of stuff informally with friends and things like that. And I've
Hmm.
done readings and things like that, but I haven't pushed it a lot because I don't feel, you know, confident enough, if I can put it that way. I don't want to lead people astray
Mm,
in some sense. I love helping people. That's something that I get a lot of enjoyment out of in life. But I'm very careful because how can I put it? I want to be very respectful of people's journeys and paths, and I don't want to overlay my preconceived ideas or things onto them. So that's where I've tended not to, um, go down that pathway yet. So it's, and I've sat with my guides. They haven't pushed me down that pathway either, if I can put it that way. But
mm,
they have brought people into my life, um, over time, or, as I said, sometimes I see people, often when I go away with friends, they just look at me and they say, well, your life's like a movie, because we'll be walking through the shops and next minute I'm talking to a shopkeeper about what's going to happen in their future, and then I'll be talking to someone else. And just in my, generally, you know, walk that I do in life, I, have a lot of interaction with people.
mm.
I think I mentioned before, a friend contacted me yesterday and said, look, there's a guy flying in from New York. He's got a similar path and past to you. Are you able to contact him and help him? So we went into Sydney, went and had dinner with him, and I had a really good chat and talked through with him what I'd learned, and if any of that applied to him and if he could take things on board with that. So yeah, I've done it that way, and I really enjoy it, but I haven't done it in a professional capacity, if I can put it that way.
You haven't formalized it yet.
Sorry?
You haven't formalized it as yet.
No, not really.
Mm,
But I enjoy doing it, and I tend to attract a lot of spiritual people to me. So I've been
mm,
very blessed in that. I've talked to a lot of people who are very isolated in their spiritual journeys, and
mm.
they're alone and they don't have anyone to talk to about
Yeah.
what they're going through. But I've been incredibly blessed in the sense that the people that, even moving to the country here, I thought, moving to the country, all my friends would be farmers, and instead I met all these incredibly intelligent, highly aware spiritual people on all different sorts of paths who were
Mm,
just incredible to deal with. One couple of friends, taught me all about nature spirits and how to work with nature spirits, and other ones would teach me all about divining and things like that. And so it's been
cool.
this, really, really blessed sort of existence. And I'm very, I have, a Viking ancestry, and
Mm,
so I have a lot of those things that I've explored as well in terms of working with nature and things. So it's, I'm pretty unconventional in the sense of I don't stick to one modality or one belief system. I see they're
mm,
all, they can all work synergistically together.
mm, mm. It sounds like you've got a very expanded worldview because of all that you've been through and the spirituality that you carry. Is there anything you could actually say to the listeners about helping themselves find their own worldview that could actually help them along as well?
I think the biggest thing I did in my life, that one of the biggest shifts, was when I decided to stop fighting myself and respond to myself with love and understanding. And so it was probably in my late 30s, I sat down, and with the prompting of my guides, I decided not to get angry with myself anymore, not to fight myself, but to learn to respond to myself with love and understanding. So if a situation happened and I got frustrated or angry or things like that, I was to sit down with myself and understand why I felt that way. And that was probably another very significant moment in my path, because instead of getting in my way and tripping myself up, I started working with myself and helping myself. And it took me a little while to get into the flow of that, because I was used to getting angry with myself. I was used to getting frustrated. I was used to blaming myself. And so I had to work really, really hard at that. And during that period, I mean, I get a lot of visions when I'm driving, which is interesting because, my conscious self is, in driving. So I think that's when my subconscious self comes up. So I remember sitting at the traffic lights in southern Sydney, and all of a sudden I see this horrible black grub, and God comes to me and goes, "That's you." And I was going through a really difficult period. So I got really upset. I go, "After everything I'm going through, you're calling me a black grub?" And then as I'm watching, obviously it turns to this incredible butterfly,
Ah,
and I go, "Oh my God, I'm sorry." I'm sorry. And that was this powerful vision, and it would come back to me at different times. I remember one day walking along the street, and it came back, and as the butterfly spread its wings, I almost flew off, like fell over, on the street because the energetic power of it was so strong.
wow.
Um, and so I get a lot of things like that, particularly while driving, because when I bought the farm, I lived between Sydney and the southern tablelands. Initially I go down once a month, once a fortnight, once a week, and until I eventually moved down here when my kids were old enough and they left home. Um, I'd start getting all these very dark thoughts in the car and think, why am I thinking all these thoughts about accidents and murders and things? And then I'd turn on the radio, and then half an hour later on the news, all these things had come up on the radio about people going through the things that I just thought about. And I realized that what I was picking up were people in trouble.
Yeah.
And so I started praying for people and doing intercessory work in the car while I
Mm.
drive between, Sydney and the farm. And then I'd notice they wouldn't come up on the radio. So that's not to say I had an impact, but hopefully I helped some people in the way. But, the whole journey, it's that journey with self. And I think as we learn, the relationship we have with ourselves is how we relate to other people. So if we can learn to love ourselves, and this is what I've said, particularly to my mother, who's very abusive, is the reason she hates everyone else is because she hates herself. So if we can, develop that self-love, and I have an incredible self-love now. I know I'm not perfect, but I actually will sit there and work constructively and cooperatively with who I am, then I feel like doing that with everyone else as well. It's sort of because, when you have the inner peace, you can have peace with other people. And that's not to say that, I don't meet people who are problematic and all those things, or not to say that I don't have my days where I lose my shit either. I still have days where I'm like, God or guys, I need help today. And they always come and help me. They always come and give me insight or wisdom. But it's
Mm.
that, it's that calling out. A lot of times when I've gone through those really difficult periods, particularly, where I started to, become suicidal because, I was programmed to basically suicide if I spoke about my past. And so, a lot of us who've been through the ritual satanic abuse, we talk about the programming and how we're undoing that. But, I just say to God, I'd say, there's all this love in the world, but I can't see it today. I'm blind. Can you please open my eyes so I can see the love? Because that's what I need to survive. And bang, all of a sudden my eyes would be open and I'd see love everywhere. And then I wouldn't feel depressed. I wouldn't feel anxious. I wouldn't feel overwhelmed. But it's just that, some days you get in your head and do your head in, and, I would do that. But for me, it's just been that constant journey and that constant walk, with the divine, with my guides, but also with myself. And as someone who, you know, I'm less and less dissociative with time, but I've also had to do a lot of therapy on my dissociative parts. When I was in the church, they wanted to exercise me because they said, well, maybe I'm demon possessed and all this sort of thing. And I stood up and said no. I looked into it and I thought, no, that's going to be highly damaging. So what I've had to do over probably the last 30 plus years now is do intensive self-love with my different parts, because there are parts of me that were programmed to be perpetrators, internal perpetrators, as a way to hide the memory. So you've got to go back into yourself and learn to love all those parts, even the parts that you hate.
Mm. Absolutely key by the sound of that for sure. Now I've got to ask you though, you talk about your guides like they're your friends that are actually just on your shoulder talking to you in some way. How do your
Yeah.
guides manifest to you? I know for me that my guides manifest usually just as like an intuition, and then sometimes there's a voice that says, "Do this, do that." I mean, what sort of manifestation do they have for you?
Yeah, it's very intuition. So it's a knowingness.
A
And
knowingness, yeah.
yeah, it's a knowingness. It's a very strong, I don't know if I've ever actually heard voices at all,
Mm,
but it's just this knowingness. And sometimes they can be very, 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 very strong with me.
mm,
If there's something important, they will just say, you know, they'll stop me in my tracks and, say, you've got to deal with this or you've got to face this or, different things like that. Um, and that's, I get my back up sometimes. My ego gets involved and things like that. But it's that ongoing journey where, you know, you know, where these souls squashed into these, excuse me, human bodies, where these limitless energy in the soul space, and we get squashed in these incredible but suffocating at times bodies. And it's a very low dense energy. So of course we're going to have dramas over things, and of course we're going to react, and we've forgotten who we are and all sorts of things. And so, I think that's why we act out a lot of times. It's that forgetting. And one of the other things that's been really helpful is, the remember who you are. And because of all my death experiences, that's helped me to always be mindful that I'm a soul and not a body.
mhm. Can you talk about your death experiences at all and how they informed your spirituality?
Um, yeah, I have there. I had one about, well, I had quite a few, like when my parents took me to the beach that day and dropped me in the ocean at Narrabeen Beach. I don't know how I didn't drown. I remember being plunged under the water by a huge wave. All I could do was dog paddle. I remember my lungs were burning and I still couldn't see the light. And you know, um, somehow I got to the surface and this guy got me, onto the beach, and I collapsed on the beach, and I was only this tiny little skinny malnourished kid, and he collapsed on the beach as well and was throwing up everywhere, both quite ill. And my parents weren't happy and quickly bundled me into the car, and I got in trouble and taken home again. Um, and so I've had about 50 like that where I've come close to death, but I haven't actually died. But it's always been like there's been an intervention. In,
Yes.
like when my father threw the brick, or the time he took my older brother and up the mountains to throw us off the cliffs, people kept on walking past where we were, and so he took us back and brought us home again because there were too many people around. They're all, another time I went swimming out in the Hawkesbury River at Windsor on a camp, and I'd been doing mess duty as part of the Australian Air League. Again, I was a small kid, but we're swimming out to this cliff and climbing up the cliff and jumping off. Well, I was late. They're all up on the cliff and they all start screaming and yelling while I'm swimming out. And what I didn't realize, when they looked down, this massive shark just went straight underneath me, and I was oblivious to it, but it never touched me.
Yeah.
Another time on the farm, I was chopping down trees when I first bought this falling down cabin that I lived in. Um, and I just stopped for some reason in the middle of doing it. I thought, wow, I'm doing really well. And I just looked at my foot, and there was this really unusual snake right next to my foot, like a couple of inches away. I thought, oh, I've never seen one of them. But this total calmness came over me. I felt no adrenaline, no anxiety. And it just slithered off, and I went inside and had a look on the computer. It was a death adder.
Whew.
So, so I had a lot of things, car accidents, all sorts of things. But it's sort of like, I've been okay. As a kid, there were things that happened. I don't have complete memories, um, where they did different things to me, where I was catapulted into the psychic realm. So I'm still trying to make sense of that.
Mm.
About, how long was it? Yeah, about 10 years ago, I had an instance. I was doing a lot of blogging and upset a lot of people, and the government was shutting down my website and things like that. And I had an incident where I had a heart attack, and then I ended up going to hospital. Um, and then in hospital, they ran all the tests and everything. They had to go out and I had to come back for an echocardiogram or angiogram. Anyway, I had to come back And in the morning, I was meant to be first in, and they took my blood, and then I just dropped that in the chair. And there I remember going into a circle with 5 other beings, and we're having some sort of discussion or conference or whatever, but I don't have a recollection of what happened. And then next thing I remember, everyone screaming at me, and I'm being pushed down the hall on the trolley and things like that, and coming back. And a friend was with me, and he just said, my eyes rolled back, and then my head, I started shaking, turned around, dropped on the floor. And it took me about, I don't know, 12 hours to get my body warm again because my heart had stopped. But it wasn't like, as I said, I don't have a lot of recollections of it, but I just have this constant awareness, I suppose, of my eternity, if I can put it that way.
It makes a lot of sense. So where are you at nowadays with your healing center that you were talking about? I mean, is that up and running, or what are you doing there?
No, not at all. So I would have lived out there. So when I end up moving down, I trusted some people who I shouldn't. I almost went bankrupt. And all I had left was the farm. And my guide said to me, "You're not selling the farm." And I'm like, I need money anyway. So I end up. The idea was to move down there and build a beautiful house and live on this farm. So I end up moving down there, and no money, almost bankrupt, and I had this little shack with holes in the wall, floors that were falling out everywhere. And where I live, it gets down to about minus 15 degrees and snow in winter. And I had no electricity, no water, no toilet, and I lived like that for 5 years. So I got enough solar panels to run my laptop and my phone, and so I was able to do a bit of work. And I still had chronic fatigue at the time, so it was very difficult in terms of energy. But because I was away from people and people represented pain, I was able to heal. And so I started to feel my pain, whereas I knew I couldn't feel my pain around other people. And the earth took my tears and the earth transmuted them. And I got back into the cycles of nature. So when it got dark, I'd go to bed, and when it got light, I'd get up again. And everything started to make sense again. And it was interesting when I lived in Sydney. As a single dad for quite a period, I'd get quite lonely, even though there were hundreds of thousands of people or millions of people around me, and I had lots of friends. But when I went to the country, there's never been a day down here that I've been lonely. It's been quite interesting. And I lived out on this farm. I couldn't see another house as far as the eye could see, but everything started to make sense again. I felt part of all the cycles. I felt part of nature. I started working with the devas, which is the overarching spirits for all the animals and things. And I said, well, look, I'm going to plant a garden. You can have this, but don't touch this. And that worked with nearly all the animals. The foxes, I said, if you don't touch my chooks, and I won't shoot you. The very next day, a fox ran in front of the car, and I hit the brakes and swerved to miss it. And then the fox diva came to me and said, now we know you'll honour your contract. And they never touched my chooks. Meanwhile, I forgot about the eagles. They end up taking the chooks. That was just another period of learning. I call it my Thoreau years in the wilderness. But this is a place that was to be the healing center. And after about 10 years, I had a dummy spit with God and said, what's going on? When am I going to build my house? And no, and all the rest of it, Anyway, so I was in the local town, and I had to, go into this house, to look at it. And when I walked in this house in town, the house goes, you're my new owner. And I'm like, I'm not looking for a house. And the house kept on going at me, you're my new owner. And anyway, I ended up buying the house. It's a healing house. It was owned by 8 doctors before me. It had a Stonehenge in it, which is this huge star the size of a room that you sit in and meditate. And the woman who owned it was amazing. And then, God came to me and said, this is your house. The farm is a healing center. So as I said, it's almost 20 years. And this year, I mean, we've done a lot of things out there in terms of people coming out and having days on the farm in nature. One friend who came out said to me, since I've been on your farm, I don't have a fear of death anymore. So there's a beautiful energy out there. But in terms of starting to do buildings and things, I'm just in negotiations with a few other friends at the moment to start to get a formal setup to it, and we're looking at things from a legal angle. We're looking at things from healing. We want to start off with basically getting all the agriculture happening. So, because to me, food is medicine, and I've always grown a lot of food and done my own herbalism and things like that. And when we grow food here, which we do already to eat, when we eat it, you can feel the life force go into your bloodstream. You can feel that, that impact. Whereas when we eat food from the farm, not from the shop, it's dead. My body goes, there's nothing in it. So the whole idea is to have something out on the farm where, one, we have the nutrition, so people's bodies are being energized. I've been quite involved in the plant medicines and been involved with different groups like Mind Medicine Australia. So starting to look at using psychedelics to help people with whether it's addictions or, getting out of their heads or things like that, or starting to deal with their trauma. And then I have a lot of friends who are in different healing modalities. So eventually we would like something, based on the buildings, because I'm an architect, will be based on sacred geometry. So I've been, working with friends, and talking about, what sort of things we can do there. But just bringing a whole pile of modalities into it, it'll take a few years to, develop. But that's the dream, and that's sort of what we're starting to work towards.
Wow, that's a huge vision, and it sounds like it's going to heal a lot of people. So I appreciate that. I look forward to seeing that come about. So, Doug, we are actually coming towards the end of the podcast now. So, was there anything that you'd like to share in the way of information about where people can find you and what you can do for people, or anything like that?
I've recently put up a website called allegedly.live, and that's just to start to chronicle what's happening, what's happened in Australia with MKUltra and ritual satanic abuse. So that's quite a heavy website. People are welcome to look at it because it's informative. It starts to map out, and it's in its early stages, culturally, how we've got to the point where a lot of the systems used by governments are more about controlling us rather than serving us, and the mind control. A lot of the experiments done on me as a child were to do with working out how to make television much more mind control. And so it's informative, but it's a bit of a deep dive. So it's trigger warning, if I can put that there. I haven't put, there are some things on there that are quite triggering for people. But I think the thing that I'd like to, and on there's a lot of link to, under the resources section, to a lot of other people who have got similar histories and a lot of research as well. Rachel Vaughan's another one in South Australia. But I think the thing I'd like to say to people is trust yourself. I think that's the biggest thing we can do. We're constantly told to give our power away to other people, to trust government, to trust everyone else. But I think, people are going to sit there and start trusting themselves and believing in themselves and knowing and loving themselves.
Yeah, that's absolutely key for sure, for sure. So, Doug, thank you so much for coming on the show and sharing all of your information and your understanding of the world and what you've been through, because it's going to resonate with some people out there in different sorts of ways and help them to see that there is always a way through. And that's an important message.
Yeah, I never ever ever give up. I got good at peeling myself off the footpath, and I'd always just say to myself, you don't know what's around the bend in the road. And even when I'd feel like giving up, I just say, just hold on. And my God and my guides would just say, don't give up, just keep going. And sometimes it is really hard work, but the more you do it, the better you get at it.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you, CJ.
All right, I'll just say goodbye to the listeners. That was a very interesting talk with Doug, and it would have been harrowing to grow up in the situations that he was in. And there's links below if you wish to read some more into that story that Doug has presented on his website. But it is pretty intense. And besides that, though, he found a way through. He found a way that actually makes sense for him. And by the sound of it, he's actually brought himself to his own understanding of spirituality and his way in the world. And it's very powerful. It was a very powerful talk. And I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have. If you have, then if you're on YouTube, like and subscribe, as I always say. And if you're on a podcast app and you think somebody out there needs to hear Doug's story and the way he got through it, as an inspiration, please share just to one person. Just one person is enough to actually get another listener to enjoy the show as well. So thank you very much for your time. And if you've enjoyed it, yeah, I'm really happy you did. Please reach out to Doug as well and say thanks to him as well. And until next time, bye for now.